I have made a lot of mistakes as a DM, and I have no doubt that I will make many more in the future. It kind of comes with the territory. When you're doing this very improvisational, on-the-spot storytelling constructed around a very complex set of gaming systems, it's almost impossible not to get a few things wrong along the way. I want to talk today about the 10 mistakes that I made that I think were not only the most major mistakes, but also the ones that I learned the most from. These are the mistakes that I'm quite glad I made early on because I think learning from them has informed my process as a DM going forward. You might be just starting out as a Dungeon Master, or you might have already established yourself, but you want to get the satisfaction of hearing about someone else's mistakes. Either way, fair play, you're welcome here. I don't have the script for this. I've just written down 10 mistakes that I made, and I'm going to kind of freestyle through it because, well, I've not done that before. Normally my videos are much more scripted. So without further ado, we're going to talk about the 10 mistakes that I made as a Dungeon Master that I hope you can learn from. Mistake number 1 is postponing payoff and prioritizing plot twists. If you're a 5th edition Dungeon Master, it's likely that as you came into the hobby, you saw things like Critical Role on YouTube, these very long, epic storylines with Matt Mercer artfully crafting these incredibly, beautifully written storylines with a really amazing cast of players engaging with them. And one thing you might have noticed is that the Critical Role games are full of incredible plot twists, these moments where the player's jaws hit the floor and everyone's amazed by the secrets that have been kept either by other players or by Matt Mercer, the DM. Now, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that as a Dungeon Master, what you should do is try to wow your players with incredible plot twists and long-running, slow-burning mysteries that have big payoffs later on in the campaign. Now, don't get me wrong, those can be good at times, those have a place, but there is a real risk in postponing that payoff that your players just start to feel like they're not getting all the information they need to care about and invest in the campaign. This was a big problem for me starting out. I had these ideas for incredible mystery boxes where the players would get very curious about what the true motive of the villain was, and they would finally find it out and it would blow their mind and it would be so cool. I was doing it partly because I wanted them to have an amazing experience and partly because I thought that was my job as the DM, but it's not, because along the way they started feeling like they didn't know why they were doing anything. Okay, we don't know what the motive of the villain is, so we don't really know why we should care about the villain or what the consequences are of the villain succeeding. I'm not saying don't have mystery boxes. Keep a few bits of information back and amaze your players later on, but remember that your players need to get the core information early on, and a plot twist 20 sessions up the line isn't worth mediocre sessions in the present. Mistake number 2 is choosing epic stories over episodic stories. Now, epic stories are good, and we all want that sense of epic hero fantasy where over a long period of time the players develop quests and goals that are finally achieved, and maybe they have to sacrifice a great deal to save the world. Again, that's all great. The issue is that sometimes when we get focused on those epic storylines, once again we can end up postponing the payoff, and we can get into a situation where it feels like session to session we're building towards something that we might not actually reach for quite a long time. This is why I over time switched to what I would call episodic storytelling. This means that my players can always get a sense that in this session or maybe the next session they're going to get a bit of payoff and conclusion with whatever storyline they're currently involved with. I really like to go for a monster of the week approach, where each session or each 2 or 3 sessions, the players arrive in a new town or a new scenario and face a new kind of challenge. There's maybe a new villain, some new NPCs to work with. I'm using the word new a lot, and that's kind of the point. The players never get in a situation where they've been stuck on the same piece of plot for maybe 10 sessions in a row, and they've not had that sense of conclusion and payoff, having invested time and energy in the previous sessions. Of course, these two approaches, episodic and epic, are not mutually exclusive. You can do both, but I find it's best to build towards an epic plotline with a long series of episodic storylines. One of my favourite examples of this is an American show called The Mentalist, in which a group of cops have to solve a different crime each week, but there's a serial killer in the background that they have a very personal stake in, and across the course of a long season or several seasons, they're gradually getting more information about that serial killer. They still have to catch the local criminal each week in whatever small drama they're dealing with, but in the backdrop, in the background, there's there's always this sense that there's a larger story to tell. I think that's the best approach with D&D. You tell episodic stories, but over time you feed in little hints that the players can pull on if they're interested and start putting the pieces together if they want to seek out a larger story. This also inoculates you against the risk of the campaign ending abruptly halfway through. I ran a campaign last year that ended rather abruptly because some of the players couldn't continue for various reasons, and it didn't really feel like a washout because we'd been doing a different little adventure every week. So although we'd only played for about 10 sessions or so, it still felt that we'd had 10 really interesting adventures across the course of a few months. The third mistake is rewarding your players too generously. I remember the first time I ran a boss battle and all my players got through in one piece and we were all so happy. And I was so proud of them for surviving, and so I wanted to give them stuff to reward them. So they fought this kind of demon lord, warlord figure, and then they went into the treasure room he was guarding, and of course I had plenty of exciting items and gold for them to pick up. Now, in those early days, I didn't really know what I was doing when it came to balancing, and of course I made a fatal flaw and gave them a bunch of equipment which really overpowered them early on. But that's not even the worst issue that arises from being too generous with your rewards. The other problem is that if you give your players too many nice things and too much gold too early on, the collecting drive inside them that makes them want to seek out dangerous quests to earn items and gold begins to fade. If they already have a couple of magical swords tucked away, then they don't really care that much if they can go out and win another magical sword. So try to avoid that kind of inflationary effect that you get when you give out too many good things too early on. Of course you don't want your players to be solely motivated by greed, but greed is a nice factor to have in the mix, because not every story can be about saving an NPC that the players really care about. Sometimes it's just doing something and getting gold, and you don't want to lose that option too early on. The fourth mistake is breaking immersion for your players. Now, this one's really tough and you can do it in a couple of different ways. If you've had a good session, the first thing you want to do is tell someone about it. If you did something really clever, if you managed to lead the players into a really cool situation in a way that you maybe didn't plan but you improvised it beautifully, you really want to tell the players. Don't do it. It's so tempting to give the players a peek behind the curtain and kind of show off the artistry of what you're doing. When you do that, you take away their immersion. You take away their sense that this is a living, breathing world. Another way you can do this is by saying things at the table that break the immersion. A great example of this is, let's say it's late in a fight. You can tell that the energy is dropping, the boss has been killed, and there's still a couple of minions on the table. If you just have those minions run away because the boss is dead, the player's going to go, great, we scared the minions off, we killed the boss, great. If, as you're doing that, you say, oh look, we're running out of time, we'll just say that the minions run off. Instantly you've made it feel for the players as if they didn't really get that win. The minions left because it was almost 10 o'clock and you guys agreed you would finish at 10 o'clock. Now maybe on some level they do realise that, subconsciously or consciously, but don't verbalise it because you will break the illusion and they will just leave with slightly less wonder than they would have had otherwise. I know it can be tough because you want to tell people about the cool stuff you did when you're DMing. The best thing I can say to you is come to one of my videos and comment and tell me about something cool you did. Go to one of your friends who knows nothing about D&D and tell them. Just don't tell your players. Mistake number 5 is driving the plot with lore and history rather than events happening in the present day. This is a common mistake made by DMs who are homebrewing their world, especially if it's their first world, because you get excited about all the ancient history and the secret wars that happened thousands of years ago, and you want that stuff to matter in the present, so it's very tempting to weave that lore and discovery of that lore into the plot and what's driving the plot for the players. Now, there's a very practical issue here, which is that the players can only remember so much, and not all players are going to enjoy learning the details of some ancient political conspiracy that led to the current situation of the realm. Some players want to kill dragons. So I would say at the very start of the campaign, make sure you discuss with your players what kind of tolerance they have for remembering the deep lore of your world, and then base the game partially around that. The other issue with driving your plots with ancient lore and world building rather than very specific present events that center around your players is that the players can start feeling like the kind of 2-bit side characters in this much bigger story. Most players want to be the heroes, they want to be the centre of the action, and they want their choices to drive the story forward, rather than the choices of some ancient king thousands of years before. They want to be in the Fellowship, they don't want to be random Gondorian guards who happen to be in Minas Tirith when Mordor attacked. Mistake number 6 is over-planning and over-prepping. This is particularly prevalent when you're a new DM and you're quite worried about the players doing very unexpected things and you not really being able to improvise effectively to respond. It's tempting to try and counter that and guard against it by over-planning and prepping every step of the process. They walk into a tavern, I need to know what happens if they do A, B and C with every single NPC in there. What happens if they try to steal from behind the counter? What happens if they start a fight? You start planning and writing notes down, and pretty soon you've got way too much stuff to really bring effectively to your table. Counterintuitively, over-planning is actually going to make it a lot harder to improvise on the spot, because you'll always have this idea of how it should have been, and when the players inevitably do something which wasn't factored into your calculations, it will be that much harder to respond on the cuff. Off the cuff. On the hoof and off the cuff mean the same thing, and I'm pretty sure I'm just merging them by accident. Anyway, the point is, don't go into it trying to plan for every player action and every possible eventuality. A much better approach is to focus your prep and planning on the environments within which the players will be taking their crazy, unexpected actions. You don't need to know what the players are actually going to do there, you just need to understand who is there and how they would respond to various different stimuli. For example, if I put an NPC into a shop and I know the players might go into that shop, I don't need to know what that NPC will do in response to particular player actions. I just need to know what kind of person that NPC is. Oh, they're quite conflict averse? Cool. When something happens where conflict is initiated, I know that NPC is conflict averse, so I will just have them try to either de-escalate or run away. I don't need to work out what the conflict will be in advance, I just need to know what their temperament is. And small things like that, a single line to describe the vibe of an NPC, how they feel about conflict, how they feel about another NPC in the same space, that's a lot more valuable than a complex list of responses to specific player actions. So if you can, and I know it's hard, try not to prepare too much. The less you prep, the more confident you will be once the improvisation starts flowing. Mistake number 7 is overcorrecting for railroading. Now, when you start out as a DM, you might look online for advice, and one of the things you'll come across is this idea of railroading, forcing players down narrow, predetermined paths, trying to make your story happen over the players. It's really annoying if you're a player, it's a pretty bad thing to do as a DM, and you start to develop a sense that that is one of the worst things you can do as a DM, and I agree, in most situations it doesn't make for a good game. The problem is that as a new DM, you might then be inclined to go a little bit too far to the other extreme and be so terrified of railroading your players and making them feel pressure to do certain things that you don't make clear to them what it is they're meant to do. Players like structure, they like goals, they like understanding what success means and what the terms of success and failure are within the context of the story. If you don't give them those clearly defined goals, they can end up wandering in circles, feeling lack of motivation and not really knowing what it is they're meant to be doing here. You'll notice this particularly in quests like investigation and murder mystery quests, where the players know that they need to solve the murder, but there's absolutely no clear indication of where they're meant to start. You might think, well, I don't want to push them down a narrow road, but telling them that, well, this person was last seen hanging out at X tavern, that might not be a bad thing, because now they'll go to the tavern and how they approach finding this person at the tavern or gathering intel there is still up to them, but they at least know where they need to go and who they need to look for. It's not so much railroading as leaving a kind of breadcrumb trail that they can follow if they want. Now, of course, if they see the breadcrumbs and they decide to go a different way, that's fine, and you can adapt and work around that. But the important thing is just to remember that giving them a clear goal isn't a bad thing. In fact, it will actually give them a lot more room to get up to hijinks and improvisation along the way. Mistake number 8 is running combat without real stakes. Now, early on, players are still finding their feet. They're getting to know their characters and the mechanics of the class that they're playing, which they might never have played before. So every combat encounter is a fun, exciting opportunity to stretch their abilities and find out what they're capable of. Over time, however, you really want to make sure that most combat encounters have genuine stakes. There's a genuine sense that if we don't win this encounter, something bad is going to happen. Now, this is very important at those later stages once there's a couple of spells in play which allow people to be resurrected, which happens at a relatively low level. Once the druid can just run in, or the cleric can run in and heal the paladin after they die, that sense of, oh my god, my character might be about to die, is less impactful. That's why you really want emotional stakes outside of the characters in most fights. Before going in to fight a dragon, your players should really know that if they don't defeat this dragon, it's going to fly down and burn the nearby town, a la Lake Town. You want them to feel that the NPC that they love, or the realm that they've been protecting all this time, is in peril. And even if it's relatively small stakes, like for example, greed-based stakes, maybe there's a dragon's hoard that they just won't get access to if they're not able to kill the dragon within a certain time limit because lava will fill up the room and destroy the hoard, that can still add a lot of tension that just wouldn't be there if the only goal was to kill the monster and leave. The other big benefit of adding real emotional stakes to combat is that it kind of neutralizes that nagging worry that you might have about a TPK. Now, or even just a player death. It's never fun when a character dies, but it feels a lot better if they die doing something worthwhile. They die saving an NPC, protecting the town that they've been building their relationship with all campaign. That's a worthy way to go. If they die because they didn't have a chance to heal before an overpowered combat with some bandits, that's not really very satisfying. And a lot of the time when you have that fear of, oh, TPK, I don't want that, it's really just a worthless TPK that you worry about. The moment where all the heroes go down fighting the Tarrasque off and buying the time for the reinforcements to arrive and defend the city, that's actually a really worthy way to go. It can be a really good end to a long campaign. It's bittersweet, but it's a lot better than dying for no reason. The ninth mistake is a small one, but I think it's still important. Don't change the outcome just because the players guessed the outcome. This is a common one when you're running a mystery and perhaps the players are trying to put the clues together and find out who is really responsible for the crime. And one of the players susses it out a little bit too early. There is a temptation to make a little change behind the scenes so you can still surprise them at the end. But that's not the way to go, at least in my opinion. I think if the player works it out in advance of when you wanted them to work it out, that can actually be a really nice moment, because it means that they're paying attention to the world around them. They're paying attention to what you're saying. Maybe they've been taking notes, and when they reviewed them, they were able to put two and two together. The best mysteries are the ones where there is a fair chance to work out the big reveal a little bit in advance of that final moment. It also feels great if the player early on went, I think it might be this character who did the murder. And you say, well, dunno, you'll have to find out. And then you play ahead and you get to that point. They're going to feel amazing when they go, I knew it. And taking that away from them, it's not worth it for the little buzz that you might get as a DM making that big reveal later on. Also, just from personal experience, players can tell. So often when that happens, you can just tell there's something not quite right in the story. You can tell that the clues were never really leading towards that character who's now apparently the murderer. That's why the last season of Game of Thrones feels so off, in my opinion, because the showrunners had that sense that people were sussing out how it might end, and they didn't want to end that, so they made some dramatic tweaks. Everybody began to feel that the substance wasn't there because the last minute it became retcon. It's not the worst mistake in the world to make, but I just think it's worth putting in here because it's one that I think is best avoided. The 10th mistake, and the one that I was guilty of early on, and I think a lot of DMs are guilty of, is taking too much responsibility for the overall quality of each individual session. Now, don't get me wrong, a DM has a disproportionate amount of control over how good or bad a game is. We are running the majority of the characters in every game. We're running all the NPCs, the monsters, the environment. So, of course, we have a big hand to play when it comes to making or breaking a session. But there's only so much we can do, and a huge amount of whether or not a session is good comes from the players. How energized are they? How engaged are they with each other? How comfortable are they at the table? And there's only so much you can do to influence that. I've had games that are really, really fun, and they're almost never because I did an incredible job. It's usually because, along with everyone else at the table, we were all on a good roll that night, it worked, the chemistry was there, and it's not always there. Sometimes the majority of the players might show up and they're a little bit low energy, or maybe a couple of the players aren't as engaged with a particular plot line, or maybe someone's just being a dick that night. You know, it's not all on you. And taking it all on you and thinking that the good sessions are all you and the bad sessions are all you, it's just not going to help you in the long run. So I think a big mistake that a lot of DMs make is taking that level of responsibility where it's their world, and if it's good, it's because they did it. If it's bad, it's because they made a mistake. It's a collaborative effort, and you and your players are all at this table and you're all contributing. And it's important to know where the limits of your control are and where sometimes the responsibility is on the players to show up and bring good or bad energy to the table. And folks, that's it. That's the 10 major mistakes that I think I made early on. I've of course made many others, but I think those are the ones that we can probably learn the most from. And I'll probably make many more in the future. I'll probably make these mistakes again, but the important thing is that as a DM, as you go along, you assess your process, you assess your performance, and you work out where your weaknesses are, where your strengths are, and you adapt to that. I just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone who stuck to the end of the video, who's stuck with the channel this far, and a huge appreciation for everyone who's gone over to Patreon to support me there. It really means a lot, and it gives me the chance to make some bigger plans for the content in the coming months. I really appreciate it.